Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to our 2021 coverage of the Iditarod here on KVRF 89.7 in the Matsu Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. You can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com, and be sure to check us out on social media by searching Dogworks Radio. And tonight we have on both co-hosts, we have Tony Ryder calling in from Kenai, Alaska, and we have Alex Stein calling in from California. Tony, how's it going tonight?
It's going pretty well.
Well, thank you for joining us. And Alex, how are things down in your neck of the woods?
Things are good. It is the weekend, which strangely I can actually tell. It feels slightly different, and that isn't always the case. But we have, as they say, a real dog race going on right now, and a lot of exciting stuff happening on the trail. Almost everyone has taken their 24 at this point, and I'd say probably about 2/3 of the teams have taken their 8-hour mandatory rest. So we're starting to get a much clearer picture of what the tiers in this race are.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the standings, and I understand that they are not up to date like the trackers are, but at last update, it looks like Dallas has about an hour and 45 minutes or so lead on Ryan Reddington. Is that the case?
Yeah, pretty much. Ryan just left McGrath. There's 8 teams who are currently in McGrath. Dallas got there first, and then he took his 8. Ryan got there about 6 hours or so into Dallas's 8-hour rest period, and there was a lot of speculation online about, well, is Ryan just going to pass Dallas? And of course, you can't just run dog teams nonstop, so he had to stop and rest his dogs for a little while, and then as we're taping this, I think he just left about maybe 15 or 20 minutes ago.
And in the top 10 there, again, this is on the Iditarod.com, we have Dallas Seavey, Ryan Reddington, Brent Sass, Wade Mars, Aaron Burmeister, Travis Beals, Millie Sled, I believe is how you say it, Michelle Phillips, Richie Deal, and Pete Kaiser. Tony, those are all very familiar names there. Does anybody really stand out in that top 10 that you have exception to, that wow, I can't believe they're here in the top 10?
As far as being surprised about anybody being in the top 10, not really. They're all very, very strong teams. It's kind of surprising to see Wade do his jump earlier today and come in 4th in the McGrath. But at the same time, it's not, because he's a really, really good dog driver. Aaron Burmeister has impressed me all race. He's actually, as we went on tonight, Aaron was leaving McGrath. So he's now chasing down Ryan Reddington and Dallas Seavey. And of those 3 teams, Reddington, to me, is the one that's the biggest question mark. His team seemed a little reluctant to get up and get going out of the checkpoint, and he has the smaller team. So it's a really interesting race, and like Alex said, it's going to be a really tight race.
Right.
I just wanted to jump in and say also that Aaron Burmeister is a really, really exceptional musher, and somehow I'm not quite sure why this is, but people don't always think of him, as one of the top contenders, and yet he has 6 top 10 finishes. He came in 5th last year. He was 3rd in 2015. And as Tony said, he is looking really, really good. His dogs are looking good. He's, I think he could be, a real dark horse who could come from seemingly out of nowhere and really challenge for this championship.
Yeah, when he came into Roan at the beginning of the race, he said he could not get his dogs to go the speed that he wanted. They were going at a speed that was a little bit more than what he wanted, but he could not slow them down further. And that sounds an awful lot like Mitch Seavey's 2017 champion team. So I've been really kind of trying not to be too excited, but seeing Aaron really challenge has been really fun to watch.
And Alex, we talked about this earlier in the week about the potential for it being a much shorter race. And I know that Danny Seavey today posted a really interesting post where it said it pretty much laid out Dallas's next few days, and it had him coming into Willow at about 10 o'clock, I believe, or 11 o'clock with daylight time, because we switch over on Sunday night. What do you think about that? That's a really, really fast race. That's even a day ahead of what I thought of. But man, that's 3 days faster than your typical early Wednesday morning, Tuesday night finish that we usually see.
I think that is probably what we're going to see. And I'll go out on a limb and say, because, of course, my predictions are always wrong, so it doesn't really mean anything for me to go out on a limb. But I think we could see it maybe even earlier, maybe even, early evening rather than 10 or 11 at night.
And for folks that may not know, they do have a mandatory 8-hour rest in Squetna, which is about 75-ish miles or so from the finish. And that's very typical. They do that in White Mountain. And they do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, to make sure everybody is kind of refreshed before the last push. And it also allows everything to sort of settle down before that last big push to Nome on a typical year. And it also helps folks. It kind of is a measuring stick by not allowing mushers just to push their dogs to the absolute over limit and overworking them. It gives that sort of roadblock, if you will, for that mandatory 8. So we have that as well coming in. So, Alex, I understand we have a couple of quick news updates. The first one is a scratch, and you also have a little bit more information about the COVID situation. What do you have?
Yeah, so Rick Casillo, who had taken his 24 very early, made it to Iditarod and scratched. He had 13 dogs at the time. There wasn't a lot of information aside from the sort of boilerplate that he scratched in the best interest of his dogs, but his wife did post on Facebook that she had talked to him and that he was fine and said all of the dogs were fine. So it's not entirely clear what happened and what was going on that made him decide to scratch. As we've talked about, this is not a decision that people take lightly. So I'm sure that there's a very good reason. And I presume at some point when he's ready, he or his kennel will release a statement and we'll find out a lot more about that.
And what's the update on the COVID situation?
Right. So the Iditarod announced that they were going to retest all of the mushers when they come back through McGrath on what I guess they're calling McGrath South, because the trail generally heads south on the way back to Willow. And also, I believe they're going to test them again at Rainy Pass and at Squetna. So there's a bunch of additional testing that has been added. Hopefully the exposure that we saw with Gunnar Johnson is isolated and there won't be any additional positives, but I think this is a very good proactive step for the Iditarod to be taking to show that they're taking this even more seriously.
Man, I can only imagine if you get a positive test at Squintina, you're 75 miles from the finish and they have to withdraw you. I hope that does not happen. Fingers crossed there for sure. In the back of the pack, we have Dakota Schlossler, Larry Doherty, Victoria Hardwick, Will Troshinsky, I believe is how you say it, and Hal Hansen bringing up the rear in the fight for the Red Lantern. I know nobody wants the Red Lantern, but after they get it, it's kind of a coveted award. But those are the folks that are back of the pack. They're either in Iditarod North, as they're calling it, meaning on their way there, except for Hal, who has left Ophir, if the thing is appropriate. So let's go over now to Tony. Right before airtime, we were talking about a story that's really picked up some steam with Dallas Seavey, and you were talking about his really fancy Musher sweater. It's one of those really cool, I guess they're Swedish made or Scandinavian made sweaters, but I guess there's a lot of hubbub about that, isn't there?
You know, I think the most popular story right now that's just silly and positive is Dallas Seavey's sweater. It's made by a Norwegian knitter, I assume. When Dallas went over in 2019 for the Finnmarkskopet, this knitter knit him a sweater to welcome him to Norway, and it's coveted not only by fans on Musher Twitter and on Facebook, but his aunt Tracy has said numerous times on her Facebook that it's her sweater. He just doesn't know it yet. I think once he's worn it for a week and a half on Iditarod, it's his, because there ain't no way you're going to get that Musher smell out. But yeah, no, I even have a poll right now on Twitter asking which one's cooler, Dallas Seavey or the sweater, and the sweater is winning the poll by like 98%. So it's actually been really uplifting just to kind of get away from the GPS tracker and just joke about this amazingly beautiful sweater.
You know, I have to say the Scandinavian sweaters, the Scandinavian wool sweaters are just fantastic and phenomenal. And I had a Norwegian sweater years ago that was great. And I keep, every time I've been to Iceland, I've been tempted to buy an Icelandic wool sweater, but they're absurdly expensive, so I haven't. But, you know, now once we're able to travel again, I think I'm going back to Iceland and getting one of those sweaters, maybe even with the paw print design like Dallas has.
You know, guys, I don't even like sweaters, and I was online looking today to see if I could find one exactly like Dallas's. I don't know if that's sort of like buying your favorite player's jersey, you know, Tom Brady, and I know that you mentioned Tom Brady earlier in our coverage, Tony, but, you know, it's kind of like wearing your favorite team's jersey, and I think that's what it is, at least in terms of mushing, for sure. So, yeah, it's a cool story to have. It's not always about ultra competitiveness, and you know, at least as fans we can muse about other things, and I think this is sort of the story of it this year. So now on a more serious note, guys, I know another really popular story that's being talked about, especially on Twitter. And you notice, guys, we talk a lot about what's happening on Twitter. So if you're a Facebook only fan, I highly encourage you to jump over on Twitter and follow along on a lot of these discussions, and you can find it relatively easy. But today happens to be the 5th anniversary of the accident that happened on the river with the drunk guy that ran down Ali Zirkle and Jeff King, and it really took the mushing community by storm. And it's a story that most of us will never forget. And being a dog musher and going out on the Serum Run trip last year, I cannot believe, and we traveled very much those same exact routes that they were on. I cannot believe how fast those guys are driving. And as a matter of fact, one of the mushers on our Serum Run trip was hit by a snow machiner and broke her leg. and she's still recovering as of we speak right now. She's still in a cast, and that happened February, early March of last year. So it's a very lingering injury for her. So this happens a lot for folks that may not know, and sometimes it's purely by accident with what happened on our trip, and then it's a little bit more malicious, being that the guy was drunk and caused all sorts of havoc. But I kind of said my piece about it, but I'd like the rest of us to talk a little bit about that. Tony, can you go first? What are your thoughts about that here 5 years later, and what is the impact, at least from your understanding?
You know, when I posted about it on Twitter this morning, it had popped up on my Facebook memories, and it said 5 years, and I was just like, no, that happened like 2 years ago. It's so fresh in, I think, so many people's memories. I'm sure it is for the mushers that had to deal with it. But it's just one of those things. Immediately you go back to the story of Allie coming in, seeing Karen Ramstead and screaming, there was some guy trying to kill me, and everybody looking around like, what did you just say? And then the next thing we hear is Jeff King has been hit by a snow machine. And the 3 dogs, there were 2 dogs that at the time of the accident or the impact, Jeff thought he had 2 dead dogs on his hands. And he just decided, instead of hitting his SOS button, he could get to the checkpoint faster, carrying these dogs and hoping beyond hope that he could somehow get them recovered, than it was to wait for somebody to come rescue him. And you just sit there and, I started watching all of the old videos that are on YouTube still, and it brings you right back. And I was just getting angry again, so I had to stop watching. But, I think any musher, especially after what happened 5 years ago, any musher that hears a really high speed sound of a snow machine, they've got to be thinking, there's danger right behind me. It was such a shock. We're used to the stories of an accidental snow machine hit, but for someone to buzz Allie 3 or 4 times and she had to fend him off with a stick, and then for Jeff's team to get hit, he said about 80 miles per hour, but then the investigation showed it was closer to 90 or 100 miles an hour. It's still so heartbreaking 5 years later.
Alex, what are your thoughts?
I just want to echo what Tony said, and I think it really kind of underscores how remote some of these areas are, and it's literally not possible to police the entire 1,000 miles, or even in this case, 450 miles of the Iditarod Trail. And there's just places where you're alone, and I think this kind of underscores also how vulnerable people can be when they're out in the middle of nowhere with a dog team. The other thing I wanted to say is, as someone who didn't really grow up in the mountains or in areas where there was a lot of snow, when I was a kid, the snow machines that we would see occasionally, maybe had a top speed of like 20 or 25 miles per hour. And modern snow machines can go unbelievably fast. It's not that unusual for a snow machine a really high-powered snow machine to have a top speed that's 100 miles per hour or more. So there's, when you consider how much damage you can do how much damage there can be in a car accident at 20 miles per hour as opposed to 100 miles per hour, that gives you, I think, a much clearer idea of the potential for harm that we're talking about. And, we talked about this when it came out, but I would encourage people who haven't seen it to watch the Ali Zirkle episode of that Netflix show, Loser, which has a very unfortunate name, but anyway, it's all about Allie and deals with this incident in a lot of detail, and it is still heartbreaking and very upsetting to me. And as people know, I have a lot of admiration for Allie Zirkle, and the fact that she was able to come back after this and finish that race and then come back the next year at such a high level is a testament to what an amazing dog driver she is and what an amazingly mentally and physically tough person she is.
One other thing in regard to snow machines on the trails like that. First off, in this area and much along the Yukon River, it's about 3/4 to a mile wide. So just think about how wide that is and give you some perspective. And from a musher's perspective, depending on your headlamp, if a snow machiner comes up behind you, they don't know you're there. They can't see anything on the trail until you're in their headlamp or in their headlight. So unless you have one of the newer, really high-powered headlamps, they will not see you until they're right on top of you. And if they're storming down the trail at 100 miles an hour or whatever, that's a recipe for disaster. And I'm sure people are saying, well, why are they driving 100 miles an hour on the Yukon River? And for folks that don't know, that is the highway of rural Alaska. That is the mode of transportation and how folks get up and down between the villages. And they carry, people, supplies, everything on snow machines. And of course, they just can't lollygag at 20 miles an hour. They're moving and shaking to move supplies and everything else up and down that river. And that's the reason why that they do go so fast. But of course, that's not to minimize this accident or activity that happened several years ago. It's just sort of the fact of living in rural Alaska. And it's a scary thing for sure. So, Alex, are there any other stories that you have before we jump over to our Musher profile?
Just one quick one, which is actually two quick ones. There's a Dallas Seavey won the first Musher to the Yukon Award by coming into Ophir on the Ophir South on the way back. This award usually is for the first Musher to get to the Yukon River, and of course we're not going anywhere near the Yukon River this year, but Dallas won that, and he will win a 5-course gourmet meal at the lakefront, which usually that they fly out a chef and do the meal by camp stove. They're not doing that this year because of the COVID protocols, but he'll be able to enjoy that when he gets back to Anchorage. And there's also, of course, the after dinner mint, as they call it, of 3,500 $1 bills and a bottle of Dom Perignon.
Very cool. And I remember seeing the pictures of people taking that feast. And like you said, they will give it to him at a later date. So in effect, back in the day, you would get that meal twice, but you're also allowed to bring along a guest for that meal as well. Tony, you had mentioned on Twitter today that Dallas also got a beaver hat, and that's pretty customary at a lot of these checkpoints where they will get native made goods, whether it's hats or gloves or whatever. Do you happen to know any tradition behind that, at least on Iditarod? Is it just a welcoming gesture, or is there a story behind that?
I think it is something that's just been tradition for so long, especially for, I think, McGrath. I know that when they traveled to, I believe it was Huslia, they also just welcomed the first Musher with a lot of handmade goods. In this case, McGrath has done it both for the outbound trail as well as the inbound. So Dallas now has 2 beaver hats as well as a pair of beaver mitts. So he will never be cold again.
Right. And those are really prized possessions by a lot of mushers when they are given those gifts, because in native tradition, you are not supposed to sell those items. You're supposed to only give or trade, which is a really interesting, I guess it would be commerce system, at least in terms of how those are done. I remember when I got my first seal hat, the lady that made it said, "I am not allowed to accept payment for this, but you're able to barter for it." And I think that was a pretty cool gesture for sure. Okay, Alex, it is the time that we really enjoy. It's the Musher Profile. It's another rookie, and I'm looking forward to hearing about who we're talking about tonight, because I have a story that you guys don't know, at least of recording time, as well as a little bit of history on the Serum Run Trail with this young lady. Who do we have?
Okay, so our Musher Profile today is Susannah Tuminelli. And just real quick before I get to her, our friend Christy Lent had posted this story earlier today that I think is really cool. Just wanted to mention very quickly, which is that there was an 8-year-old boy who fell into a river in Skwetna and was rescued by an Iditarod volunteer from Wyoming who was up there working the checkpoint, and an Alaska trooper. And they were there, and this kid fell into the river, and they were just able to grab him and pull him out and get him to safety. So that's kind of cool. A nice thing that you don't always hear about volunteers doing something like that, but it's just part of the flavor of the race. So Susannah Tuminelli is 28 years old. She's originally from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which is near where I grew up. And then when she was relatively young, her family moved to the South Shore of Boston. And she is someone who has always been in love with the outdoors and outdoors activities. So from a very early age, she enjoyed sailing, and they have a public sailing boat system in Boston where you don't have to own a boat. Anyone can take out a boat and go sailing, as well as hiking, spending time with her childhood dogs, which were Libby, a greyhound, Jack, a Jack Russell Terrier, and Gracie, who was a Labrador. She went to college in Vermont, and when she graduated in 2015, she decided that she wanted to go out west and do something else involving the outdoors. So she lived and worked in Montana, building and fixing hiking trails with the National Park Service and the Forest Service. And that was mostly kind of a seasonal summer and fall job. So she was looking for something else to do that involved the outdoors in the winter. And she got a job in northern Minnesota guiding winter camping trips and learned how to mush dogs there. She was working with this company called the Chili Dogs, which had mostly retired Alaskan Huskies, sled dogs, and she guided trips for the Boy and Girl Scouts in the Boundary Waters Wilderness area. And she did that for a couple of years. And then at the same time, in the summers, she was guiding sled dog tours on the Mendenhall Glacier with Alaska Icefields Expeditions. And then since the fall of 2018, she has been living with and training with and racing with dogs belonging to Kathleen Frederick in the Shameless Huskies kennel in Willow, so your neighbors. And that's a kennel that has about 35 dogs. And she completed her Iditarod qualifiers about a year ago. And she is running this team of Kathleen Frederick's dogs. And the team consists of Homer, Hope, Honor, Lorikins, Feisty, Aurora, Talk, Caswell, Justice, Louis, George, Cherish, Bride, and Groom. And she said that Homer and Hope are her two best leaders, and she calls them the dynamic duo, and says they're extremely reliable, and Homer loves butt scratches more than anything, and Hope just loves going on errands, going in the car, going to the coffee shop where she gets puppuccino treats, and she's training Honor to be a new leader, and says that Honor is amazing when the going gets tough. So whenever she runs into a particularly rough situation or a rough part of the trail, she always puts Honor in lead. And she said that Feisty is moving towards being a leader. So started out like as a dog in the back, and moving up to like a team dog, and she's going to try leading her as a leader a little bit in the Iditarod. And also she talked about Cherish, as she described as the most nimble wheel dog she's ever seen, who gets along with everyone and loves to cheerlead for the team. And just as in any sport, with any team sport with human teammates, it's always great to have that one person who just makes everyone feel better. And I think that's a very important part of a dog team as well, which sometimes gets overlooked. We tend to spend a lot of time talking about the leaders and maybe ignoring some of the contributions of some of the other dogs. So she is currently in 31st place. She's past halfway, so she is between Iditarod and Ophir going back. And as we started recording, she was about 40 miles from Ophir. So that is a very good and very respectable rookie run that she's having.
You know, Alex, I spent about a week with Susannah last year on our Serum Run trip, and she was preparing for this race. She was handling for Kathleen Frederick, who was also along the trip with us. So I got to know her pretty well there. For longtime listeners of the show, you may remember we interviewed Susannah about a year and a half ago, right after she finished her qualifiers, and she was talking about growing up with mushing, or at least from college on, and coming to Alaska to eventually run her dream one day of being in Iditarod. So a great interview there, as well as just a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed the owner of Chili Dogs Sled Dog organization. His name's Jake Hui, and great interview. And I believe he and I talked a little bit about Susannah on that show as well. You can find those episodes over on dogworksradio.com. But there's a really interesting story about Susannah that just came out today. I believe I saw it on her boyfriend's page. Now I'm looking at the story on the KTUU page. But it's my understanding that Susannah was taking a really long rest in between one of the checkpoints, and she was enjoying herself. She was laying down with the dogs, enjoying the sun, and she says that she was sleeping really hard, and she woke up and her parka was on fire. And she looked down. She had no idea what was happening. Of course, she was just awoken from a pretty deep sleep. And it turned out that she had some matches in her pocket. And somehow, they have not figured out how, but somehow those, through fiction or static electricity or whatever, caught on fire when she was asleep. And luckily, she caught it, because when you're that far into the race, usually when it's time to crash, you crash, and you crash pretty hard. So I'm surprised that it woke her up, first off. And secondly, of course, that she and all the dogs are safe. But it's a really interesting story that you can find over on, you can find it pretty much anywhere online, but I'm going to put it on our show notes. There's even a video of the interview as well. So definitely check that out. Tony, do you have any other things that you would like to mention about Susannah before we go?
Just based on that story, it's not Iditarod until somebody or something catches on fire that shouldn't.
I concur. I've had some of those same mistakes on races that I've taken part in for sure as well. So very good, guys. Alex, I always check with you last because you always have a nugget or two sort of laying in the wings. Anything else before we go?
I just wanted to say that we are in a very, very fast race, and it's kind of exciting. I'm feeling this year like I miss having all of the journalists who are always on the trail, because I feel like there aren't as many stories coming back from the trail this year as there are most years. I imagine we'll hear a lot of these things later, and we're getting some of them from social media and from the friends and kennel helpers of these teams. But I just have a feeling that there's a lot of stuff going on that we're not quite tapped into. So I'm looking forward to all of the stories that are going to pour out when the race is over.
And just a couple of quick shout outs for some of our fans. Our friend Patty posted on Facebook today that she enjoys listening to the show every night with her husband. She said that she curls up with a comfy blanket and turns our podcast on and settles in for her nightly ritual during Iditarod. So we definitely want to give a shout out to Patty. She's been listening to us since the beginning. And interestingly enough, it's my understanding that we had a wake-up ritual for a lady in Kansas. She was listening to us at 7:15 this morning, and she was awoken to our husky howl intro that we have. So very cool. We have people commenting and listening all over the world, and we're glad that we can bring at least a little bit of happiness to them and give them some insight to what we do. And as we've always said, and we haven't said this year, if you're new to our show, we're much different than others. We just don't talk about the front of the pack. We just don't regurgitate the typical news stories. We talk about things that we find interesting and give our perspective to as well. So it's very cool that we have both of you guys along the ride this year, and I'm liking the format, and I think a lot of our fans are as well. So with that, we will be back on tomorrow night, and if you are asking what time, I highly encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, and miraculously, it will show up on your smartphone, whether it's Android or iPhone or whatever, or your computer or whatever, it will show right up. So subscribe to our show, and you'll get an instant download as soon as it drops, whether it's 8 o'clock our time, midnight on the East Coast, or if we do it earlier in the day as well. So with all of that, we'll wrap up, along with my co-host Tony Ryder and Alex Stein. This is Robert Forto for Dogworks Radio. We will see you guys tomorrow. Goodbye.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio.